Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on how to prepare for Office 365 license renewal. I'm Paul Robichaux, and with me is my faithful companion, Pancake, who we refer to at Quadratech as the product owner. If you hear any cat noises, I promise it's not me, it's him. Welcome. Office 365 license renewal is a bit like going to the doctor for an annual checkup. Nobody really looks forward to it. People don't say, "Oh, I'm so excited that I'm coming up for my 365 renewal." That's because the process is a little mysterious sometimes. It can be painful. But really, I think the reason most people are uncomfortable at license renewal time is because Microsoft seems to hold all the cards. They have the licenses, they set the pricing. There's not a lot of room for negotiation. And many of the customers that I've spoken to feel like people feel when they buy an airline ticket. I hope you remember that. It's been a while, but when you buy a plane ticket and you get on the plane, you never know if you paid a good price. You never know, did you get the best possible price? Did somebody else pay less than you? Are you getting good value for your money? The whole experience is just sort of disconcerting. So I want to talk about some ways to maybe make license renewal a little less painful and less mysterious, starting with understanding what you actually have versus what you need to satisfy the needs of the people in your organization. So I just mentioned using Microsoft's free tools. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy of Microsoft to silence tool vendors who don't want people talking about the inadequacies of Microsoft's own tools, but I'm also not saying that it wasn't that. The biggest thing to think about really is not what tools you use or how you get the data. It's a little bit heretical for me to say that, but in all honesty, if you can encourage users to use what you've already bought, that's a key component of having a good licensing experience, and it's very important to get good results. You can every so often adjust the amount of money you spend on licensing, but at any time you can adjust how users are using the thing that you bought, which means that that's a big advantage to you if you were able to successfully do that. Then we'll talk about the difference in mindset between being stuck in Microsoft's world of truing up to a world where maybe truing down is a possibility, using third-party analytics such as the ones that Quadratech provides to help you do that. Now, before I get into talking about that, I do want to make the distinction between true up and true down. So what Microsoft assumes is that licensing is a ratchet that only goes one way, or a valve that only goes one way. And so when they talk about truing up in an enterprise agreement or an open select agreement or any other kind of licensing agreement, what they mean is, okay, you as a customer have bought 500 licenses and you discover that you really need 550. So at license renewal time, Microsoft wants you to be able to true up your license and buy up to get the additional things that you need. That's great. It often happens that as organizations grow and change, they need to add more licenses. So I'm here for it. But you know what? It's also true, especially in this time of pandemic and uncertainty, that sometimes you need fewer licenses than what you've already bought. That's truing down. I'm not going to be giving away any big surprises to say Microsoft is not really a big fan of truing down. They don't want to encourage you to do it and go to some lengths to prevent it. But arming yourself with data about what you actually have, what you use, and what you need is a good way to help break that log jam and get them to pay attention to your requests in a more serious way. And then finally, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Let's start by talking about the landscape behind licensing. If you think about the factors that play into what license usage looks like, the first are the people in your organization, your workforce. What do they do? A workforce that's mostly made up of people who physically manufacture widgets on an assembly line is going to have different needs than a workforce where it's primarily people who sit in office cubicles and work with information. So a manufacturing company is going to have a very different profile of workforce than a bank will. And a bank will be different to a university. And a university will be different to an airline. So first step in understanding what you actually need is got to start with a good understanding of who the people in your organization are and what they do and how they perform their jobs. Second is the workplace. So these are the workloads that people actually use. You probably have heard, and you may even have said, wow, our business completely runs on email. Okay, now one remarkable thing about that is if you think back 10 or 15 or 20 years, if you've been around long enough, that was not always the case, right? There are many organizations that ran for decades on paper. And so email was a hugely disruptive transition for them. Well, guess what? We're seeing elements of that same kind of hugely disruptive transition now with the advent of Teams and OneDrive. And Yammer, maybe, I'll give them partial credit for that. But the workloads that people use to get their jobs done will have a huge impact on licensing. And then finally, your options for licensing are the third component of the landscape. So if you need a particular set of workloads, what is the license option from Microsoft that gives you the best return for value, that costs you the least or gives you the most? Now, for those of you who are in the UK, you're well familiar with the phrase mind the gap, meaning don't step in the gap between the underground platform and the train. For those of you in North America, it may not be as familiar to you. But there's a big gap between licensed, purchased, and optimized licensing. What we're trying to get to, of course, is a world where everybody has exactly the right stuff for that combination of the workforce, the workplace, and the licensing options that are available to them. So if you think about the way that this works, we start with some set of licenses that we bought, and then some amount of those licenses get assigned to people or to objects such as shared mailboxes. Here, the gap between what we bought and what gets assigned are licenses that were overpurchased. In other words, we bought too much. If you've ever thrown a party and you bought 24 cupcakes and you only had 10 people come and you ended up with half a dozen cupcakes left over, you're familiar with that metaphor, right? Then we have the number of licenses that are assigned to accounts that are actually deployed to the user. What does that mean? Well, it comes about from a feature of the way Microsoft does licensing. So imagine for a second that I have a Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise license, what we used to call Pro Plus. My admin has assigned that license to me, but I've never activated it. I don't have Pro Plus installed on any devices. That would represent this little gray bar over here on the right-hand side. So the license has been assigned to me, but I haven't deployed it. Even if I want to use it, I can't because I don't have the software installed. Now this next bar is even trickier. This underutilization gray bar represents licenses that have been given to the user that she isn't using. Okay, I'll give you a real world example. Quadratech hires somebody. We assign that person an Office 365 E5 license. We give that user a laptop, and then we ship the laptop. So in that period of time between the time that we have assigned that license to the user and the time the user opens her new laptop and logs in and activates Office, okay, that license is underutilized. Now, that may seem like a contrived example, and in some ways it is. Let me give you another one. We have a customer that has about 10,000 employees in the hospitality space. So most of these workers in their company are frontline workers who are directly interacting with their customers. Reservation clerks, concierges, people who work in the hotel restaurants, housekeepers, and so on. If I have one of those users who has an E3, and the only workload that he uses is email, he's underutilizing all the other E3 workloads. He's not using the Pro Plus apps, which are the most expensive component of an E3. He may not be using Teams. He's probably not using Flow or Planner. So there's a significant underutilization there in that population of users. So if you start with the number of licenses you buy and you trim it down by getting rid of or minimizing overpurchasing, underdeployment, underutilization, you get to this nirvana of optimized licensing. So Interesting fun fact. Usually when people use the phrase fun fact, it's not fun and it's often not a fact, but I think this one qualifies. Out of the 3.4 million users that we have under management across all of our enterprise tenants, we saw an 18% overpurchase delta. Simply put, what that means is these enterprise clients bought 18% too many licenses. When you think about the actual cost behind each of those licenses, you can see that can add up to significant money. And I'll run through what those numbers look like for a nominal customer here in a few minutes. So there are two very simple principles that I want you to remember every time you think of licensing. Because, I mean, let's be real, right? Licensing is top of mind. We all think about it all the time. No, I'm just kidding. That's football. So the first step, first principle, buy only what you need. Stop over purchasing. Now, here's the trick. How do you know if you're over purchasing? Well, I'll give you a couple of suggestions later on in the presentation to address that. But in general, if you don't have a good, repeatable process for understanding how many of a thing you need to buy, it's going to be very difficult for you to buy the right number of things. And that's true for cupcakes at a party. It's true for any other kind of household good. It's true for pretty much anything. The second step is to increase utilization and adopt everything that you buy. So interesting, we, in working with this hospitality customer, found that they had made a conscious decision to buy E3 licenses for every one of their employees. Now, given what I just said, you might say, wow, that's crazy, Paul. Why would they have done that, given that most of these people work in roles where they don't have a dedicated desktop PC or a dedicated place of work even? Well, the answer is very simple. They ran the numbers, they looked at the capabilities of the E3 license, and they said, you know what? We can get more business value from giving everybody these tools and training them how to use them than we would get savings from taking those licenses away. Now, I'm going to be very candid. That almost never happens, right? The flow almost always goes the other way, where people want to cut back and not expand on their licenses. But it's a cool idea to look at somebody who's kind of gone against the flow there. So if I want to take those two principles and turn them into a thing you can actually walk out of here and be ready to do, let's start with buying only what you need. Before you can buy only what you need, you have to know what you actually need. And in this case, need, which I put in quotes, is the delta between what you actually have and what you should have. Now remember, in engineering and math teams terms, delta just represents a change between two quantities. It can be positive or it can be negative. You may need more licenses or more SKUs than what you currently have, and you may need fewer. But the only way to know is to go dig and find out. You do that by asking a lot of fairly boring questions. But it's not hard to get the answers if you're already within the organization. So one example would be, how many users do you even have in your organization? Okay, that sounds like a really stupid question to ask, but you know what? There are a fair number of people who don't know or can't give you an accurate answer within 10% because they are a small part of a large organization, even though they may be responsible for some piece of licensing. They may not have clarity. What do those people do? What do their jobs look like? What functions do they need? And what are they currently doing? In other words, do I have users who are very heavy email users and they have Teams, but they're not using it? Do I have people who have OneDrive and use it heavily, but don't use SharePoint, et cetera? And the third question is interesting too. Where are these people? So where do they sit in the organization? Where are they physically? Are they concentrated in one geography? Are they concentrated in one business unit? This may not be applicable to companies that are sort of monolithic and have all their employees in a single business unit in a single place, but although that is very common, I wouldn't say that's universal. Then there are some more difficult questions to answer, but these are also the ones that are going to tell you more and give you more insight into what your organization looks like. The first one, how many licenses do you have right now? So I talked with a very large enterprise a couple of weeks ago that had 270,000 users. And when I asked them the question about how many licenses they currently have, they said, well, it's somewhere between 250 and 300,000 because they have a very large enterprise agreement with Microsoft that gives them a lot of float. So they do have the ability both to true up, but also to true down. Now they pay a lot of extra money for that privilege. Just as with airlines and real estate and many other domains, when you pay more money, you get more options, right? And of course, most of us would not be willing to pay that flexibility tax. But they didn't, one of the side effects of paying that tax is they did not have to care about exactly how many licenses they had. But you know what, for most of the rest of us, we have to care about that pretty intensely because that's the basis that Microsoft uses to charge us. How are my licenses distributed? So this is a little bit of a funny question because if you only have one tenant, they'll all be distributed in one tenant, but you may not. Very common for us to see customers who've got multiple tenants because they have multiple business units and end up needing to understand how licenses are allocated across those tenants. Finally, here's a fun question. How much are you paying for your licenses? Now, if you're like most organizations, you're going to have a mix. You'll have probably the majority of your licenses that come from a single agreement or purchase. But then as you have trued up in between renewal cycles, maybe you bought a new subsidiary or added a group of employees and you needed to go out and buy 100 more licenses. So you thought, okay, right, the simplest way to do this, I'm just going to go to the Microsoft portal, I'm going to buy those licenses, clickety click, 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 put in a credit card. Now you have those licenses. Well, guess what? They have a different expiration cycle and a different purchase term than the licenses you bought in bulk. You do that enough, and pretty soon what you'll see is you have some E3s that were bought over here, you have some E5s that were bought over here, you have some other E5s that were bought over here, and it is very difficult to keep track of what you have, how much you're paying for them, what currency you're paying for them in, who's responsible for payment, and so on. So I mentioned earlier that Microsoft has some tools, and they do. They are happy to give you a basic view that shows what licenses you bought and even gives you a little bar and some subsidiary data about what those licenses look like, when they expire, how many are remaining, and so on. Okay, so if you look at the screenshot over here on the right, that's an example of the kind of thing that you see. If you only have a couple hundred users, this is probably adequate, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. I would love you to buy Quadratec's tools to manage that number of licenses. But in practice, the tools that Microsoft gives you will probably be sufficient, especially because you can take these and download this data in the form of a CSV, which you then can use for historical reporting, which Microsoft does not give you, or to share as a download or to provide charts or graphs, which Microsoft does not give you. And then, of course, you have PowerShell. So if you're comfortable slinging PowerShell, you can write a script to get this data and massage it however you want to. But I'm just going to go out on a limb and point out, not everybody wants to have to write PowerShell to get this data. That's, I think, a fair comment. The bigger problem is that if you only have the data that Microsoft gives you, that limits what you're able to do. So as one example that we run into all the time, you can't do internal billing or chargeback, because if you go back to the screen I just showed, that just shows how many licenses there are in the tenant. It doesn't show how many are assigned to your business unit in Germany or your sales department. Now again, this is not something that everybody needs to do, but the bigger your organization, the more likely it is that you will need to do it. And if you need to do it, too bad. Microsoft doesn't have anything to help you. You can't figure out which job roles have licenses assigned. So suppose that you wanted to automatically assign one set of licenses to engineers and a different set of licenses to salespeople. and a different set of licenses to your customer support team. Microsoft has some fairly primitive tools to do that assignment, but not to report on it. There's no way for you to see the breakdown of how licenses are allocated between countries, between business units, and so on. And there's no way to tell what percentage of slack you have. Now, remember earlier that 18% number that I mentioned? We refer to that as license slack. It's sort of the amount of leftover rope you have. If you imagine stretching a rope between two objects that are a certain distance apart, where the rope is longer than the distance, you've got leftover slack in the rope. So a slack of 18%, that's pretty high, right? That's about 1 in 6. You wouldn't know how much slack you have just from Microsoft's data, because you can come here and you can see the utilization percentage for each of these licenses, but they're not aggregated, right? And it doesn't take into account things like licenses that are assigned to a user account that has been disabled. So, free pro tip, not at all biased here, you might want to consider a tool like Quadratec Nova to get that data if you have a need for that level of visibility into your licensing environment. So as an example of one of the baseline reports that we build into Nova, this is a subscription overview view that shows you some of the same things that Microsoft shows, but also tells you what your utilization percentage is, the number of idle licenses you have, and then we have a configurable field that lets you enter how much money you're paying for each of those licenses. So you can very quickly say, okay, I have 51 idle licenses and I'm paying $8.80 per month. Ta-da, what does that tell you? Well, you're spending about $440 ballpark per month on licenses that you aren't using. Okay, $5,000 a year. That's not a trivial amount of money. Okay. We also give you reports to show who has what licenses. So you can see here, I only have 2 licenses in this sample who actually have Power BI licenses assigned, but I have 100 total. I can see, some simple graphics about what fraction of my user base has different types of licenses. The reason why I focused on Power BI and Visio here, and I would have included Project, I just didn't have room for it in the screenshot, is because those cost money also. Now, fun fact number 2, now that Microsoft is starting to enable users to buy their own Power BI and Visio and Project licenses in the tenant, your challenge of managing them has gotten both much easier and much harder at the same time. It's easier because, well, in some ways, if the user's paying for it herself, you don't care, right? That's no skin off your nose. Except that most of us have broader responsibility, and we're responsible for what happens in our tenant, even if the user is paying for something and being reimbursed by the company. That's still an expense we would want to be aware of. Okay, Microsoft likes to talk about user managed IT, but you and I know it's really shadow IT. And this is not the time to get into a philosophical argument about whether it's good or bad, but I think it's fair to say we all want visibility into it, whether we think it's good or bad. So the next question that comes up is, what licenses do I actually need? You know the Microsoft answer already. Buy all the things. Give everybody an E5, buy Teams Advanced Communication, buy compliance licenses, give them Visio, give them Power Automate, etc. Well, okay. There are environments where it does make sense to do that, depending on what people do. Also, depending on the license terms that you were able to get from Microsoft. So that very large 270K employee company, they have a lot of leverage with Microsoft because of who they are, because of the industry they're in, and because of their size. They spend a lot of money on desktop and server OS licenses, and they spend a lot of money on Azure. So they are able to negotiate with Microsoft in a way that you and I can't. So for them, it's easier in some ways to just buy the entire buffet, even though they have one person at the table who's only going to eat chicken nuggets. That's not universally the case, though. Everybody already understands the basics behind licensing of the workloads. So you already know who needs E3s and E5s based on what they do. You probably also know who can get by with an F3 because they don't need the additional workloads that come about um, when you upgrade to an E3. You probably also know who needs add-ons for things like Visio and Power BI. Now, here's an interesting thing. If you have an add-on license like Visio, those are allocated to the tenant level. So if I go into my tenant and I buy 50 Visio licenses, now all of a sudden, any global administrator in my tenant can assign those licenses to somebody. Now at Quadratech, that's not a problem because we have a small number of global admins. But if you imagine a larger company where I may have one global admin for North America, one for Europe, one for Africa, and one for the Pacific Rim. Well, if the North American admin buys some licenses for a group of users that she manages and assigns half of them, meaning to assign half the next day, there's nothing stopping that admin in Australia from stealing those licenses and assigning them to his users as soon as he sees they're available. People hate that. They hate it so much that we built tools into Nova to allow you to prevent that. So if that kind of license rustling is a problem for you, we should probably talk. Now, I mentioned on the previous slide that there are things that you do know, but I think it's fair to say for most of us, there are also things that you probably don't. Or I won't say that you don't know them. I will say it is difficult to figure them out using only the tools that Microsoft gives you. One is who has more than they need. So which users have licenses assigned that they are not going to use because of their job function, because of where they work, because of what they do, because of their own preferences, right? I've still got users at this super technical company where we live and breathe Microsoft 365 who don't quite understand that you don't mail attachments around anymore. You use OneDrive. So there is an ongoing educational component to figuring out who has more than they need. But a first approximation is, okay, if I've given somebody a workload, are they active in that workload? Have they done anything with it? If they haven't, then that opens up some opportunities for me to make some changes to either save me money or increase value. And I'll talk more about those in a minute. The other thing that you will generally want to know is who has fewer licenses than they need. Now, interesting point here. I mentioned that hospitality company earlier that made the pretty bold decision to just give everybody a bigger license than they would normally, because they believe that their employees can benefit from that increased capability and that will lead to increased productivity that will outweigh the cost of the licenses. At probably every point in your organization, you can look at a group of users or look at a job role and say, this job would be a lot better, or the people who do this job would be more efficient if. Now, what comes after the if can vary hugely. Maybe it's if they all had laptops and could easily work from home, or if they were able to use Teams and get all the functionality that Teams has instead of being stuck with what's in GoToMeeting or Zoom. If they knew how to and were allowed to use Power Automate to automate some parts of their normal work processes. I can't tell you what comes after the if in your organization. I can tell you that if you start asking that question, some of the answers you will find involve giving people licenses that cost you money. So if that's true, where are you going to get those licenses? Well, I mean, it's no secret, the first place you would ideally like to get those licenses is by reclaiming them from people who have licenses and aren't using them, as opposed to having to go out and buy more, right? If I already have an ingredient for tonight's dinner in the refrigerator, I don't want to go back to the store and buy another package of the same ingredient unless I need twice as many packages. So if I show you an example of what a utilization report looks like, this is one of the baseline reports that we include in Nova. And what it shows in this 90-day inactive Exchange users list, these are users who have a license that includes Exchange, an E3, an E5, F3, Exchange Online P1 or P2. and yet have not logged into the mailbox or sent or received any mail in 90 days. That means they're inactive. Now, perfectly reasonable. One of these is a service account. One of these is for someone who's on maternity leave. One of these is for our outside counsel who has a company email address but never uses it, etc. Right? The point is not that everybody on this list is someone I need to take a license away from. The point is now I know who's not using that license and I can make a business decision what to do about it. Same thing for SharePoint. Okay, notice here, Carrie, because she's out on maternity leave, is not using her SharePoint license either. I don't want to take that away from her. If I were to scroll down in this live report, you'd see that I have the same data for Teams, OneDrive, and so on. Right? The point being, from this report, I can start to get a sense of how many users do I have. In this case, I only have 7 inactive Exchange users. When I run this in a larger tenant, I would expect to see a larger number. And that's when I can start to cherry pick and say, okay, these are service accounts, so it's okay that they are not using Exchange. But these others are live users. Why aren't they using Exchange? Now, generalize that to being able to see utilization data for the desktop applications that cost you extra money, for Visio, for Project, for Power BI, for international and domestic PSTN calling, and you start to see the power of being able to see what people are actually doing with the licenses that they do have. Which leads me to the other principle we talked about earlier. First one is buy only what you need, and the second one is adopt everything that you buy. So let's start with, basic truth. Email is easy. Everybody's going to adopt email without you having to lift a finger, and they probably already have. Right? I'm working with a customer right now that is doing a brand new deployment for an operating company that they are setting up from scratch in a country in the Middle East. So they're just now renting office space and hiring employees and so on. You know what? On day one, everybody who walks in that door and begins work on day one is going to log in and use email. They don't need to spend any time trying to convince people or to make that happen. But the other workloads are where you can either make money by increasing productivity or save money by reducing that licensing gap. So I mentioned earlier that 18% Slack figure. That represents users that have a license and aren't using it. So in a 10,000 seat organization, 18% of that is 1,800 users. The stock cost, if you just go to Microsoft's portal and you buy 1,800 licenses, Microsoft will sell you those licenses for $20 US per user per month. That's $432,000 per year. Now, if I were presenting this live to a room full of people, I'd be looking around and I can tell you the expressions I would be seeing on people's faces. The first expression would be that 18% number is baloney. Okay, that's a fair criticism. You tell me what the number is in your organization. If you don't know, good news, I can help you find out. The second objection, okay, our Slack is 18%. Sure, you got me on that one, but we don't pay $20 per user per month. Okay, that's also fair. That's the rack rate that Microsoft charges anybody who walks in off the street. And if you have negotiated a different purchase agreement with them, probably you're paying less money. So let's say that you're really only paying $10 per user per month. Okay, so you're only potentially going to save $200,000 a year instead of $400,000. Still worth looking at. So even if you only had 1,000 seats with 18% Slack at that rack rate price, that's still almost $50,000. So your individual numbers are going to vary. But the point is, if you don't know what those numbers are, you don't know how much money you're talking about. And that's fatal when you go in to talk to Microsoft to negotiate your license renewal. Because without knowing that, you have no idea if you're overpaying. And you have no idea whether you're getting a good deal. Because in this case, a good deal is measured by, am I buying only what I need? And can I adopt everything that I buy? So your goal is to get to that point of having optimized licensing. Right? Well, remember, what are the components of optimized licensing? First is figuring out who's not using licenses that you have already paid for. So you can either stop renewing those licenses or downgrade those licenses to something less expensive, or maybe reassign those licenses to someone who can benefit from them. So how do you answer that question? Well, who doesn't have the expensive M365 apps deployed? Who's not using OneDrive, or who's not using Teams, etc.? Who's not using the extra cost licenses that you paid? Okay, that's step one. Once you know how many of those people there are, that starts to give you a sense for what your Slack percentage and Slack data looks like and what it means. In a large organization where you have flat rate licensing and you have seasonal employment, like a FedEx or a UPS, you might have 18% Slack, and that might be good for your organization. For most of us, though, 18%, not so good. So the next step is, where it's appropriate for business purposes, downgrade people. If you have somebody who's got an E3 and they never use anything other than email, you may be able to justify a business decision to downgrade that person to an F3. Again, business decision, not an IT decision, but it's a decision that nobody can make without adequate data. Now, this third point is really where you can make a positive impact on your business. You can be a hero. Every single customer that I've talked to about licensing since about the beginning of March this year has said some variation of the following. We had to start using Teams right away. And I thought it was going to be a giant catastrophe, but it's really worked out well. People just natively took to Teams and started using it. And the IT organization looked really good because we were prepared and able to help people work remotely. No kidding. I've never had a customer say, oh my God, Teams was a dumpster fire. Or wow, I sure wish we hadn't bought those licenses that included Teams. So if you think about what it means to use adoption and change management to encourage change in the organization, you can look at what had to happen for COVID-19 remote work support and draw some lessons of how you can positively encourage adoption to get people using the other workloads that will help them be more productive and more capable, more flexible, etc. Now, because this is not an adoption and change management webinar, I'm not going to spend time talking through what all those things are. Merely point out that adoption and change management techniques are a tool, a very powerful tool that you have in your toolbox to help get to optimized licensing. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think of adoption as a marketing campaign, most of us don't like being the victim of marketing campaigns. I'm looking for a car to replace my car, which is replacing my son's car at college. Because Lord, that thing is just about to blow up and turn into a flaming pile of junk. So I made the mistake of filling out the contact me form on a car dealer's website. And I mean, it wasn't even 10 minutes later that they were trying to call me. And they couldn't because I didn't give my real phone number because I wasn't born yesterday. But they have a very well-refined marketing campaign flow that means the minute somebody fills out that form, take these actions. It turns out you can use that same type of strategy for positive purposes too. So if you think about an adoption campaign, if you're trying to get someone or a group of people to start using a technology, how would you go about doing that? Well, you would want to be able to know who's actually using which workloads and how often and how much. You'd want to be able to say, okay, you know what? If you send one file with OneDrive one time, okay, that's not nothing, but I don't consider you having adopted it until you're using it regularly. Maybe you use it every week for a month or whatever, right? The point is you need to be able to define those metrics. Next, you need to be able to gather baseline data right from the beginning so you can see what happens as your campaign progresses. Are people starting to do what you wanted them to do? Finally, you need to be able to define multiple campaigns and run them in parallel so you can approach different pieces of the organization differently. If you don't have that data, then really all you're doing is shouting at users. Use OneDrive. You should try Teams. And as you probably all know, shouting at people is not the most effective way to get them to do what you want. If you have good adoption tools like the ones that we make available in Nova, you can very quickly get a sense for what a good level of adoption looks like. And when I say good, it maybe ought to be in quotes because good is going to vary according to your own organization's needs. But you also can see what workloads people are using, what they're doing, when they're doing it, how they're working to help drive your push toward optimized licensing. So if I look at an example of what adoption usage reporting looks like, this lets me see for Teams usage, okay? When is Teams being used? Where are my biggest teams? Who are the users who are using Teams the most? So for Teams, we've got workload specific metrics around chats, calls, and meetings. We're just adding something that I'm really excited about, which is meetings scheduled and meetings attended. So if I look and I really want people to be using Teams, I should be able to look at their data and go, wow, you know what, Paul attends 1 or 2 meetings a week and he schedules 0. Okay, well, that may mean Paul's job role does not require him to use a lot of meetings. On the other hand, if I have someone whose title is executive assistant and is not scheduling any meetings with Teams, I mean, presumably that person is scheduling meetings, given that they're an EA. So where are those meetings going? Oh, look, they're going in Zoom. Oh, look, they're going in WebEx. Well, how cool would it be if I could avoid having to pay for Zoom or WebEx licenses by getting this EA to convert to using Teams for the meetings he books? This is the data that helps you drive that type of change. So I'm not a licensing expert. I will be the first person to admit that because being a licensing expert is somewhat like being maybe like an IP attorney or something else where it's very finicky, a lot of very small details, and knowing the exact fact pattern is critical to coming up with the right answer. But I know some experts, so I sat down with one of them, a gentleman named Ben Marshall at Blue Chip Solutions. All he does all day long is advise very large customers on how to make or save money by changing the way they do licensing. So I asked him, Ben, if I were going to give my webinar attendees 5 things that they should be asking as part of their renewal process to make sure that Microsoft doesn't take advantage of them, what would be the top 5 things that you would advise them to ask? So without further ado, here they are. The first is, what's your current usage? How many licenses do you have? Where are they? How many of them are actively being used regularly? Next, have your needs changed over the course of your last renewal contract? Now, this is a very interesting question. Again, if we were doing this as a live event in a room, I might ask for a show of hands to say, hey, who has had a staffing change in their organization as a result of COVID-19? Well, I think it's safe to say probably all of us have, right? But there are other changes too. There are positive changes that come around from mergers and acquisitions. For example, we have a customer that has 130,000 users that were formerly spread over right around 130 tenants. And they're consolidating those down to 1 tenant. So the thing is, if they have 100 users in 1 tenant and they move those 100 users to the consolidated tenant, what happens to those 100 licenses in the source tenant? Well, their needs have changed because they don't need to renew those licenses. They just need to sort of forklift them over. Now, probably not a big surprise. Microsoft is willing to work with them in a way that they might not for a smaller customer. But understanding whether your business needs have changed is critical because ironclad rule of negotiation, you certainly will not get what you don't ask for. And so if you're able to say, look, Microsoft, I know that I currently have X many licenses, but you know what? It turns out I need a smaller number, or I need a bigger number, I need a different number. You're certainly not going to get any concessions from them if you're not able to show the data that underlies why you're asking. Have your buying options changed? This is interesting because something we didn't touch on because I am completely unqualified to talk about it. all the different ways that you actually can give money to Microsoft to get a license. I mentioned buying licenses in the portal. There are a lot of other ways that you can do it besides that. The actual ways that you as an individual customer buy your license, probably not important. For this conversation, that's the kind of thing where if you are large enough, you might consider approaching Ben at Blue Chip and saying, look, I could use some help in figuring out the best way to buy 150,000 licenses of this thing that I need. I would love it for us to have a wizard or a bot that can negotiate with Microsoft for you, but we're not quite to that point yet. Do you have needs that can't be satisfied by a single contract? Now, this is really interesting because even for the smallest organizations, I bet you do. That's because Microsoft still, for the most part, sells Azure, on-prem, and 365 licenses separately. It is very much to your advantage, if you can, to get those combined into a single agreement, because then you have more leverage. But there's a trick to that you need to know. Just like if you go to the car dealer and you say, I'm going to trade in my old car and I want to buy a new one. Well, the dealer has all kinds of tricks that she can use to change the final number that you pay. And one of those tricks is to overinflate the value of your trade-in, which then has an impact on the amount that they appear to be charging you or that you appear to be paying for the new car. So if you go to Microsoft and say, right, I want to consolidate Azure and on-prem and 365 licensing in a single contract. And Microsoft says, oh, that's great. We're going to give you XYZ. Well, check the numbers for the things they are not, quote unquote, giving you very carefully. Because what they give with one hand, they may take away by adjusting the prices or the quantity or the license term of something else. And then finally, man, I can't overemphasize this. If you have a complex organization, if you're bigger than a couple thousand seats, it is absolutely worth having some help from a licensing provider, a CSP, or some other party that is not Microsoft in helping you manage your license contract and license negotiations. Now, I say that without prejudice. That's not a thing Quadratech does. So I'm not hawking my own stuff or blowing my own horn here. But the bigger your license is, the more money you're talking about, the more value you get from having an expert to consult with to help you understand this. So you could call somebody like Wes Miller at Directions on Microsoft. You could call Ben at Blue Chip. There are several other consultancies that do nothing but help you rationalize your licensing and make sure that you're buying the right thing. But before you can talk to them, you have to have data about what the right thing is. And that's where Quadratech comes in. So with that said, Chris, I don't have anything else to add, but we have some time for Q&A, and I think we have a couple questions in the queue.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, it really is astounding how much free money is gifted to Microsoft, particularly in times of economic uncertainty. Yes, we do have a few questions. Firstly, does Microsoft really allow true down?
Well, that's a good question. Microsoft will allow nearly anything if you have something they want. So, as I mentioned before, this large enterprise customer with 130,000 seats that we're doing tenant consolidation on, they have been able to true down because otherwise they'd have to pay. Their migration is taking a while. It's a complex project. It's going to take them more than a year. So you can imagine that for some of the tenants that they're migrating, they otherwise would have to buy licenses for that tenant in January, even though they know they're going to migrate that tenant in May, let's say. And of course, they didn't want to do that. So they were able to work out a deal with Microsoft where Microsoft would give them some leniency on the licensing terms. So when you go in to sit down with Microsoft, your net instinct is probably that they absolutely will not let you true down. I mean, that's when you true down, you are offering to give Microsoft less money and buy less stuff. Of course, they're never going to be enthusiastic about it. But if you have data that enables you to make the case, they can be very receptive. Remember, they would rather sell you something than nothing. And as long as you keep that in mind, have data to back up for why you're asking what you're asking for, you may be able to get relief during a license mid-period. One thing that just dawned on me that we haven't talked about at all in this webinar and probably should have, so sorry about that, is the fact these license agreements are almost always multi-year. And so if you go to Microsoft, if you're in the middle of year 2 of a 3-year agreement and you go to Microsoft and say, hey, Microsoft, I'd like you to let me stop paying you for 5,000 licenses. That's going to be a tough sell. Okay. Doing a midterm true down is much more difficult. If you try to do it at license renewal time, well, then it's not even really a true down. You're just buying less of something. Best tip I can give you if you want to try a midterm true down, if Microsoft thinks that you're going to buy more of something else, they're more likely to be willing to give you relief on one license. So if you go to them and say, look, we moved from having corporate devices to bring your own device licensing. So our new employees are bringing their own devices and we don't need to buy as many Windows Enterprise licenses, but we'll buy more Azure to make up for it. You're going to have an easier time than if you just go in mid-year and say, oh, I don't want to pay for these things anymore. It's always a tough sell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's in their interest to help you optimize your adoption to secure your perpetual renewal, isn't it?
Anytime you can do that, right? Microsoft, they want to sell you all the things. So if you give them hope that there's something else they can sell you, that makes it more likely that you'll end up getting relief on the thing that you want.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. What does active user mean for a workload?
Well, how long is a piece of string? It all depends because Microsoft has one set of metrics that they use when they're considering whether a user is active or not. So for Teams, as an example, one of the things they look at is a 28-day rolling average of activity where they want to see, did the user do anything in the Teams client? So if I come into work Monday morning, what is today, the 20th? And I launch Teams and I just let it sit there. I send no messages, I receive no messages, I open no files, I don't join any meetings, but Teams launched because it launched automatically when I logged in. Is that active? Well, in one of Microsoft's metrics, yes, it is. It's active because the Teams client was running at least one of those 28 days. Now, that sure doesn't mean active in my worldview, right? Where if you have a thing, but you're not actually doing anything with it, that doesn't count. So a better way to think of it is within your organization, what does active mean? In other words, if you think about, okay, if someone is using a tool to do their job, how do I know that they're really using it? Well, for email, it might mean that they're sending or receiving a certain number of emails. I don't know what that number is. That's going to depend on you and what your employees do. Same thing with Teams, same things with the other workloads. You have to look at what does a typical person in this role do with the tool, and then set usage thresholds that reflect when someone is active versus inactive.
Cool, thank you. We have another question, which I believe is related to Nova reporting. SharePoint and Teams usage, is that based on document and chat creation? Can it actually tell a red event only?
So that's an interesting question. From the unified audit log, I have the ability to tell when somebody has read a particular document. So if I want to know, did Chris open this PowerPoint deck that I shared with him, I can do that. And I can even build a report in Nova that shows me what documents Chris has touched or looked at in the last 7 days, or all the people who have opened a particular document or whatever. If what you want is to know whether a user has read any document, which I think is probably the intent of the question, right? Microsoft doesn't give you that data natively themselves. I think I could probably build a query to give you that information. I don't know, I'll have to try and find out. So one thing we didn't talk about at all, along with the Nova reports that you get built into Nova, we also have a community site where we internally call them Lego bricks, but we have report sections that you can download and integrate into Nova yourself. These are basically a query that gathers some data and displays it. So I'm going to play around with this and see if I can figure out a way to show me who which users have read any document in SharePoint, say, in the last 7 days. And if I'm able to figure out how to do it, I'll put it up on our community portal. If I'm not able to figure out how to do it, then I'll turn that into a product feature request, because that's actually kind of a cool idea. So
That's
thank you for
great.
that.
A good one to follow up on in the future.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that wraps up the Q&A. Thank you very much, Paul. Very informative session. I hope our attendees found that information useful. Did you have
Yep,
any?
I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'm thankful that my cat didn't cause any more audio issues on the call.
It's always a pleasure to hear Pancake in the background. Do you have is there another slide you wanted to share?
Yes, maybe, but there we go. Okay.
There we go.
Chris worked hard on this slide. It would have been very offensive of me to not even include it. So we actually have a white paper that talks about strategies you can use to close that gap between what you have bought and what optimized licensing looks like in your organization. So you can get it from quadratech-it.com/license management gap. Of course, you'll be able to see in the recording of the webinar this URL. If you want more information on Nova, which is our 365 SaaS management platform that does everything I've talked about here and a bunch of other marvelous things that we didn't have time to get into, you can learn about that from quadratech-it.com/Nova. So drop by there and learn about it. I think you will probably be pleased with what you see.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Paul. We will be sending out a recording to all registrants, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint deck, and we'll get that out to you in the next 24 hours or so.
Sounds good to me.
Hope you can join us again sometime. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Bye-bye.